Hello, assalamu alaikum, good morning, khush aamdeed, ji ayanu, goeiemorgen, pakhair ragale, washmale, chunishume. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to World This Morning on such a pleasant and special morning. Well, without Shazad Khan today, only with Shazad Hashmi, that is why I stole most of his greetings. Other than that, it happens to be a Friday morning. My favorite because we are heading into a weekend. And well, this day happens to be my favorite for another reason. Today happens to be the 3rd of May. And ever since 1993, a lot of countries, including Pakistan, have been observing and celebrating this very special day that we call Press Freedom Day. When we're talking about a nation, ladies and gentlemen, I feel like media now happens to be the 5th pillar of a nation, of course, because the role of media or the role of press, technically, is to inform every person out there, the general public, of the decisions that are being made by the governing bodies and whatever changes, the policies, interactions with other countries and whatnot. Because when you vote, when you're part of a system, especially in terms of democracy, this is what you expect, right? You want to sort of be updated with whatever's going on with your country and the decisions that are being made for you because you have to live with them. Well, just for a little background, this was adopted in 1993 by the United Nations General Assembly, and it was inspired by actually the 1991 Windhoek Declaration. This was in Namibia, Africa, which spoke about the independence of press. And then, by 93, it was sort of, realized that this needs to be not only a part of Africa, but every state out there in the world. Let's talk about the theme for this year of Press Freedom Day, ladies and gentlemen. It happens to be Media for Democracy, Journalism and Elections in Times of Disinformation. And I feel like this is so relevant, especially in today's time, because, of course, we happen to have our general elections as well over a period of times. We recently went through them a few months ago, and then I feel like we have a lot to talk about it. Then in terms of, our neighboring country is again going through some elections, and we need to discuss that as well. We need to discuss press of freedom and democracies and dictatorship and everything. But before I introduce my very apt panel of guests to you, we have a small package report that one of our amazing correspondents made about Press Day. Let's take a look at this, and then we come back, start a conversation. Stay tuned. Good morning.
Government accountable.
To hold corporations accountable.
To hold us all accountable.
I am not a liar.
I am not unethical.
I work every day to find the truth.
The United Nations General Assembly declared 3rd May to be World Press Freedom Day to raise awareness of the importance of freedom of the press and remind governments of their duty to respect and uphold the right to freedom of expression enshrined under Article 19 of the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
A free press is essential for peace, justice, sustainable development and human rights. No democracy is complete without access to transparent and reliable information. On World Press Freedom Day, I call on all to defend the rights of journalists whose efforts help us to build a better world for all.
Invention of press was human beings' first step towards social liberation. Roots of organized journalism in the subcontinent are traced back to 19th century. Names including Maulana Zafar Ali Khan, Maulana Abul Kalam Azad, Diwan Singh Maftoon and Agha Shorish Kashmiri laid foundation of press information as a solid institution. Their legacy is well carried by modern-day journalists. Social and electronic media may have established their mark, but people do focus on the authenticity of papers even today. Lack of focus, both in terms of training and provision of security, are main concerns of journalists. They are also facing issues like insecurity of jobs and absence of ruling towards access to information. Incumbent government has promised to legislate and implement laws in this regard. This day also pays tribute to the journalists who sacrificed their lives in the line of duty. One may hope that the dawn of prosperity and security will soon rise for journalists fighting for truth with the sole power of their pen. Seema Babasi, PTV World, Islamabad.
Well, this was super informative, especially for me early in the morning as well. We are talking about Press Freedom Day, ladies and gentlemen. And this year, the celebrations and the conferences are going to be jointly organized by UNESCO, of course, African Union Commission, and the government of Federal Republic of Ethiopia. So when we talk about press freedom, I feel like, well, this is, of course, my personal opinion. Pakistan right now is enjoying a lot of press freedom, like it has been over the past few years as well. But there wasn't a time in Pakistan, especially in the 70s, which was not very good for journalists. And before that as well. But that is what we're going to be discussing as well. So without further ado, introducing my guest to you. On my right-hand side, we've been joined by someone who's been very gracious on our show before as well. Well, she's none other than an international journalist. She's a photojournalist especially. She's none other than Saina Bashir. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it's always my pleasure. Next to Saina, we have someone, again, a regular of the show. He happens to be here more often than usual because he is the very right person, especially to talk about this again. He's a journalist, also a lawyer. This is none other than Sheikh Danish Iftikhar. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the show.
Walaikum assalam. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming, because when we're talking about Press Freedom Day, ladies and gentlemen, it needs to be about journalists and, you know, their freedom, their creativity, and the boundaries that they have to their original creativity, especially. And since you both are journalists, I feel like this panel is so apt. To start with, Saina, the importance to observe this day, especially in a country like Pakistan.
Well, it is extremely, you see, everywhere in the world.
Yeah.
I mean, press is basically, journalists are watchdogs, right? So imagine a world without, if we didn't have police to protect us, if we didn't have security forces to protect us, if we didn't have lawyers to fight for people's rights, what kind of a world would we live in, right? So it is extremely important because journalists all over the world are watchdogs, right? They are documenting history. They are a witness to everything that's taking place. They're the first, you know, people to reach anywhere, whenever something is happening.
Exactly.
They're the first, just like, you know, the ambulances reaches a protest or an accident. That's how journalists also reach, you know, well in time. So they're the ones who are witnessing everything and documenting history. So it's extremely important to recognize them, respect what they do, and to celebrate their freedom as well.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for saying that. That was so beautiful and rightly put as well. Sheikh Saab, what about you? The importance of this day, and then we can come to the theme of this day.
Well, we're talking about the celebration that we do, but we must also remember the significance of the lives lost on this, you know, throughout the year.
Yes.
And, you know, the people who are behind bars or they're missing, the journalists I'm talking about. And quite recently in Myanmar, the two journalists from Reuters, you know, they were imprisoned, and just a day ago, their conviction was upheld by the Supreme Court. And so they have to serve 7 years in jail.
Wow.
And we were talking about the conference which is taking place in Ethiopia.
Yes.
They have just yesterday decided to award them with a prize, a UNESCO prize for, you know, for the struggles they've made. So I think we should stand behind all these people who are struggling to, you know, for their freedom, for liberty, and for their lives, and, you know, just trying to do their job, nothing else.
That's so true.
And, you know, in a way, we also have to see that, you know, why we commemorate this event. Why was this declaration made about the Van Dam Declaration that you were talking about? This is, in effect, you know, a recognition by the global community that in democracies, you know, you must have a free press. And those people who say that these are like Western notions and, you know, they have nothing to do with the Eastern values or, you know, in other cultures, I mean, I think they are wrong in the sense that they're not doing anything out of the ordinary. You know, what they're trying to do is they're just trying to get the truth out of everything, be it, you know, governance issues, be that corruption, political corruption, you know, be that mafias, you know, organized crimes. What they're trying to do is they're just trying to put it to the people, you know, what the actual news is, what the actual facts are. So if they do not get their due protection, you know, then in effect the freedom of press is affected.
Okay, Sheikh Saab, you being a lawyer, I feel like you really have to sort of shed light on this as well. I mean, me being the general public, I do have the right to information of my own country, the laws that are being made for me. But what are the rights of the journalists?
Well, you know, the Article 19 of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you know, it actually specifies that, you know, there must be freedom of press. And for this freedom of press, there have to be protective measures being taken by the respective states. And, you know, the purpose of Van Dam Declaration and commemorating this day as the International World Press Freedom Day is in effect, you know, to also put governments at, you know, at notice that, you know, they must do their jobs, they must pass legislation, they must work to ensure the safety of journalists, not only at their workplace, but also at home.
Outside at workplaces as
And
well, yes.
I mean, this year has not been that bad for journalists as far as Pakistan is concerned.
Yes, absolutely.
I mean,
right.
the most number of journalists who were killed, they were from Afghanistan, and they were
Unfortunately.
16 in number. And the next was Mexico, and similarly there were other countries. India was at 7. So in all, about 90 odd journalists were killed last year,
That is
and
so
about
unfortunate.
350 journalists were missing from their, from their homes.
Residences as well, yeah.
Yeah. So what I'm trying to say is we have made huge leaps, and we have gone a huge distance in ensuring the protection of journalists and
Right.
ensuring the freedom of press. And just some days ago, the DG ISPR, what you were mentioning about 1971,
Okay.
that we didn't have freedom of press.
Yeah.
He also recognized this fact.
Oh, perfect.
And it was very, a very honest admission on his part, and I think it was in effect. A state institution was recognizing the role of the media, that had this media, the present media in its present form
Yeah.
in Pakistan, had it been present in 1971,
70s, right?
not
Okay.
only India would not have succeeded in its conspiracies, but also the cruelties being meted out by some people in East Pakistan, they would have been unveiled, and Pakistan would not have been dismembered. So this, I think, is a huge, significant,
Absolutely.
achievement in the sense that there is a recognition from our state institutions.
Right.
Previously, in the previous bygone eras, they were thought to, crack down on these
obstacle
kind of
especially, yeah.
freedoms, and like Ayub Khan's dictatorship and Ziaul's dictatorship, we know, and even Musharraf's dictatorships.
Right, yes.
Channels were banned, and press was not free, and journalists they were not safe,
Right.
and
Often jailed
proper
as well.
laws were not passed for their protection and for the minimum wages that they must get from
Right,
their
Sheikh Sab, you actually
from
linked
their
me to my
owners.
next question when you
Yes.
talked about dictatorship. Well, the theme for this year, again, I will repeat, happens to be journalism and elections in times of disinformation. So we are sort of looking at democracy as well. So this is for both of you. Do you feel like, press freedom is more prevalent in democratic societies or, well, under dictatorship? What do you feel?
Absolutely in democratic
Okay.
nations, of course, because they realize that they cannot have a democracy without a free press.
Okay.
Because they're the ones who provide people public with information, right? And public, their opinion is based on the information that they're being provided with.
Absolutely.
And in the recent year or two, we've seen a lot of disinformation in a lot of elections. In the recent U.S. elections,
Right.
there was a lot of
It's still going on, the case.
disinformation, right? And that's also because of how it's because of the internet. And how everybody has access to it,
Right.
and everybody has started. Anybody can make a website. They can call it a news publication,
Right.
whether it's authentic or not.
Without even having a license to it, right?
No, absolutely not. And then those publications are also funded by certain people. So that's where a lot of disinformation stems from.
Right.
And it's with Twitter, with like blogs, it's become very easy today to sway information in the direction that to sort of provide disinformation to the public. And yeah, we're seeing that in the Russian elections,
Yeah.
in Ukraine. It's happening everywhere, right? Yeah.
Absolutely, and even in the unfortunate, tenure of the previous government, we sort of had some allegations in Pakistan as well. But so, Saina, you say that democracy is actually a better, let's say, a feeding environment for press freedom, right? What about you, Sheikh Saab?
Well, I would just like to add a thing that we were talking about democracy and how I think it does enable a conducive environment for a free press. But then again, we have examples where even in democracies, people are not giving the press the freedom that they deserve.
Yes.
Like for instance, in Somalia,
Okay.
this ongoing discussion which is taking place in the conference, there was a reference made by a Somalian journalist to what is happening in her country. And during the elections, what happened was that opposing candidates, they would float news about their competitors having withdrawn from the elections.
Okay.
And
Fake news.
Fake news. It
Okay.
was completely fake.
Okay.
And that was done in effect to, obviously to gain advantage in the elections. So that is also something which we must also look after. Even though democracies they do provide a conducive environment,
Yeah.
but in Ethiopia, for instance,
Okay.
Ethiopia is recovering right now under the President Ahmed.
Okay.
They have freed about almost more than a dozen journalists, and they have also unblocked many websites.
Oh,
So they are
perfect.
going in the right direction. But still, we
Yes.
have democracies where people are resistant to change.
Okay.
They are resistant to. I think they think that they construe that the crimes of the society or the gross injustices in the society would portray their society in a negative manner. But I mean, that is not the whole point of journalism.
Okay.
That is not the whole point of free press. It is obviously to highlight what deficiencies we have. So as a society we grow, and the constitutional safeguards that we have, those are not infringed upon.
Perfect.
And I mean, the first step towards dictatorship, towards authoritarian regimes and martial laws has always been a free press. The first line of defense for democracy is a free press.
Is a free press,
And
okay.
once that is trampled, once that is taken away,
Yeah.
all other things follow, and there is people are deprived of information. They don't know of their rights. And in dictatorships, sometimes even fundamental rights are taken away.
Absolutely.
Like it happened in Ayub Khan's era. He took away the fundamental rights. He removed them from the constitution of Pakistan.
Right.
So, the free press, in actual effect, what it does is it lets the people know what their rights are, what is going on in the society, and how they can improve or develop their roles as positive citizens in a democratic unit.
Very rightly said, Sheikh Saab. Sana, you had something to add to this conversation?
Yeah, so having said that, democracies all over the world, historically, for example, in the US, they have been practicing freedom of press for a very, very long time, right? So when you compare that to a country like Pakistan, we're relatively new. We haven't been practicing freedom of press
For a longer time.
For a longer time. Which also means that we don't have journalism institutions in Pakistan that have been around for even more than a decade.
Okay.
Which, actually, so that doesn't allow the journalists over here to have the proper training. So even in our local channels, you see a lot of disinformation, you see a lot of ethical issues, the way the reporters work, the way the broadcast journalists, they don't follow ethics a lot of times.
Right, that's true.
So having journalism institutes is also very, very important for a country, and to have and that affects the freedom of press.
That is so true, Saina. But now let's sort of drift away from a very generic conversation that we've been having for a while now. This is probably going to be a tougher, pill to swallow, but you both are journalists in Pakistan right now, but both of you, especially for Saina, I know you've been working abroad as well as a journalist, in the US or Canada as well, right?
US.
So what are some of the changes or differences that you feel in the working environment here and there?
So there's a lot more objectivity in the US in terms of journalism. I mean,
which is great, right?
Which
That's
is
the basic.
that is the number one rule of journalism, which is objectivity. You don't put your own opinion into anything. You just state the facts. You report on things as it is.
Okay.
And you are held accountable if you don't do that. You can lose your job. Over here, I feel like when I watch the news, people, the anchors can say whatever they want. I mean, whether it's news or it's not. I mean, whether they fact-checked it or not. So that's a really big issue. Also, I mean, there's a lot more freedom of press in the US than in Pakistan, of course.
Okay. Well, facts out there. That is perfect.
Yeah.
What
and
about? Okay,
and they have they have a lot of well laid out laws for journalists. And their
that is
freedom.
where we lack, right? I mean, we will definitely have almost similar environment if we were to have the right laws and then implement them too, right? What about you, Sheikh Saab? Do you feel like there's a difference in terms of, freedom of press in this part of the world as compared to the other parts?
Well, there is actually quite a lot of difference, and I mean, we do talk about how much freedom we have in Pakistan, and we are free to report about, a Vadera doing some injustice to his tribal members, or likewise. And we also can talk about the government, whether they're increasing the prices of petrol or not, and what effect it's having on the public. There are many avenues where we are free to report about. But then again, I mean, as was previously talked about, we don't have that responsibility, with that freedom.
To report rightly.
To report rightly, and the consequences, of not reporting rightly are not huge or significant. in a
Often
sense.
overlooked as well, yeah.
And they're overlooked. And plus, I think sometimes, the journalist associations, I mean, they must be commended for the wonderful job they're doing.
Yeah.
But sometimes, I mean, I think that some people, they take refuge in these kind of journalistic organizations, and they say that, that this is an issue of freedom of press, whereas it is an issue of the ethics and, the morality of the whole situation.
Absolutely. And there are even some people who would use these organizations or let's say websites or whatever for misinformation for their own ulterior motives and whatnot. Please hold that thought, Sheikh Saab. Right now we're heading out to a very short break. When we come back again, we will be talking about misinformation and, wrong reporting in terms of citizen journalism, because every one of you out there who has a smartphone is also a journalist. Stay tuned. Good morning. Welcome back to World This Morning, which is Hashmi on the 3rd of May, where we are observing and celebrating Press Freedom Day, especially in a country like Pakistan. I love to take pride in it because we have definitely gone through some phases in the past where there were absolutely no rights or even recognition for the journalists out there. But right now we are celebrating them and then talking about the work ethics and everything. But before we move on to the prevalent conditions again, let's talk about, your work in both of you. So in a situation where you are free to report anything, what kind of issues would you focus upon?
There are gender issues, there are religious minority issues, there are accountability issues to hold certain organizations accountable. I mean, those are the kind of issues that one would go after if you were free to report on anything.
Okay, perfect. What about you, Sheikh Saab?
Well, I would, in addition to all of those mentioned, I would like to say that we try to give the voiceless a voice. Those who are the downtrodden,
Yes.
those people who nobody talks about or discusses, in the parliament or, giving those people voices and, talking about their issues, because in a sense, those are the people who have sacrificed so much to ensure the continuity of this state.
True, that is
and
true.
that sacrifices have come, they're again subjective, in the sense that if you talk about the Muhajirs, who left Pakistan, who left India to migrate and come to Pakistan.
Right.
And, discuss their issues, because they left everything. They sacrificed their lives and the lives of their, family members and also their property, and came just to ensure that this state is, becomes a reality and not just a theory. So,
Okay.
I mean, I'm just taking an example.
Yeah, yeah.
And otherwise also, people who are affected by organized crime, how their lives are affected, if somebody is killed or somebody is injured and there is no recourse to justice. And, this is not just about I'm just not talking about gunfighting.
Okay.
I'm also talking about the deaths which take place in the hospitals, in our institutions,
Okay.
and the people who are deprived of education, they're deprived of health.
Okay.
They're deprived of basic amenities and facilities which the state
Right.
must ensure that they must get.
Right.
And also remind the rulers of the promises that they made in the past,
Most important.
most important.
So
And
important.
because if you don't do that, then there is no check and balance on them.
Right.
And the media has become such a powerful force, in today's world and age,
Yes.
that even political leaders and even governments, they say that we get information through news.
Yes.
So their whole, the whole apparatus of the state, they have so many civil servants and so many people under their umbrella, but they cannot do the news of, what the media is doing.
Right.
So we try to highlight these kind of issues,
Okay.
and we try to maintain objectivity.
Okay.
And we also try to get the version of the other party, because that is also very important. You can't
Okay.
just level allegations without, taking the views of the other party concerned.
Okay, perfect.
So that is something we look to ensure.
Right. So, Saina and Danish Thakar sahab, now we have to talk about again press freedom, but in a way that I want a responsible journalist answer from both of you. So let's look at any news or a piece of information that would be a threat to national security. Should that be dealt with or stopped in any way?
Well, it depends
Okay.
what the issue is, because a lot of times what a lot of countries do is that they hold certain information in the name of national security. So do we know that that is actually a real threat to the national security, or is that information just being kept under the name
Right.
of national security? So
Yes.
that's another thing to look at,
Right,
right?
and Saina, I feel like what you said, we've very recently witnessed in terms of the Sri Lanka attacks, right? I mean, Indian officials claimed that there was sharing of information and intelligence with the officials over there, but the officials claim not. So, I mean...
So you see that's where the trust comes in, and a lot of times I think with freedom of press, what happens is that a lot of times there's a mistrust between the government and the journalists.
Okay.
The government, instead of looking at journalists as watchdogs, as somebody who is actually helping them protect a lot of things, such as
Okay.
democracy, information, a lot of those things, but they look at them in the eye of like, oh, they're our enemies, they're after us, they're trying to hold us accountable for things. And then in a lot of cases, like the Reuters journalists and Jamal Khashoggi, I mean, the second a journalist is attacked, it is highlighted even more on what that journalist was working on, what story was he highlighting, what is wrong with with reporting on that. So
there's no way
instead
you
of
can contain it
no,
anyway.
you can jail journalists, you can murder them, but the stories are not going to be buried with them.
Absolutely.
They're
Very
going to
rightly
be
said.
highlighted even more.
Very rightly said. What about you, Sheikh Saab? What do you think about this?
Well, I agree that there should be a debate on what national security is and, the parameters of that, and who should define that and who should enforce that.
Okay.
And I mean, apart from that, I mean, in our constitution, the Article 19, also in our constitution, it also imposes certain restrictions on the
Right.
freedom of press.
Okay.
And and the courts of Pakistan, the judiciary has also interpreted that the freedom of the press is not absolute,
Okay.
and it is subject to reasonable restrictions. What those restrictions are, I'm not going to go into detail, but
Right.
just to give you a few examples, I mean, we can't comment on relations between friendly countries,
Okay.
On friendly countries,
understand,
we
I
can't
understand,
comment too
yes.
much on that. We cannot go against Islam, that is also another restriction. And there are also other special laws,
Right.
like for instance, there is for example, the cigarette advertising, we're talking about
Which has been
cigarettes,
banned, yeah.
which is something which is banned.
Yeah.
And if there was freedom of expression per se and there was no restriction, they would, and this has been argued by the cigarette advertisers
Okay.
that, we should not be banned from advertising our product. But the courts have said that, this is not a ban or not an exercise to curb the freedom of press.
Right.
Similarly, in other instances, where there are sensitive installations, for example,
Okay.
we are not allowed to take sketches of that or take photographs of
Photographs,
that.
right.
So what I'm trying to say is that although the freedom of the press is, it should be ensured, but there are certain restrictions which every state has imposed.
Okay.
Even in the United States, they have got restrictive injunctions against printing of certain publications. And then what happens? But what happens in that case is you have to go before a judge, and the judge decides that whether injunction should be granted or not. What I'm trying to say is, if there are limitations or restrictions, they should be exercised with caution.
Okay.
And they should be reasonable, exercise of what a reasonable person would do.
Okay.
Not just imposition of your subjective will or intention on others.
Okay, Sana, you have to add something?
I do agree with that. I mean, national security is extremely important for any country, and we must protect that. But having said that, there is still a lot of information. For example, in the US, you can FOIA the information. You can request the government to provide you with certain government records, and over there also they say that certain documents cannot be provided because of national security. But then a lot of times we do see that that's also a term that's used in a lot of ways where the government doesn't want that information to come out.
To come out, right, that's true.
So it depends, really.
Okay.
In certain cases we are actually protecting national security, which we should be doing, of course. But we cannot FOIA like government records over here the way you can in the US.
Okay.
Any citizen can go to the government
They
and
should have
file a
access to-
request and access those documents.
All right, I totally do understand that. And just a while ago, Saina actually mentioned the trust factor between the journalist and the government or the authoritarian regime, whatever that is, in power. And then I feel like it's sort of a triangle. When we're talking about the trust factor or the relationship or, the genuinity of the relationship, it's not only between the journalist and the government, but between public, journalists and the government. So the question is, should it be stronger between the journalist and the public or the journalists and the government?
Well, there are a few examples of, countries which have introduced these kind of measures where the public is also made, part of the whole scrutiny process.
Okay.
Like in the UK, they have the Complaints Commission, and the public is also part of that. So, I mean, there is a need to involve the public, the general public, because they are the best judges of their own interests.
Of course.
And, they are the best judges of what should be or should not be reported.
So you're saying journalists should have a better relationship in terms of whatever they're putting out with the public?
They should.
Okay.
They should seek feedback. They should seek, reviews. They should go by. But I mean, sometimes, when we go towards ratings, if you only talk about ratings, if public is watching something, we think that the public is liking everything and absorbing everything, which is not always the case.
Which is not true,
And, and that is why we see this kind of flaring up of arguments on national
Or hate
television
speech
and
even
hate
sometimes.
speeches and, these kind of publications, which incite people to hatred, to, religious acrimony and, and these kind of, not acrimony, but these kind of divisions.
I get it,
So what I'm trying to say is that if the public is not involved,
Okay.
then there will be a disconnect. And whenever there is a disconnect, and the job of the press is affected. So the public should always be, and I always, encourage these kind of programs where the anchor persons, they go out in the field.
Right.
And, they report on just staying in the studios and asking questions from the politicians. That will only give a certain perspective.
Absolutely.
Because even the politicians, they are disconnected from the public after winning the elections after a certain period of time.
But
So
also
if you-
very masqueraded in terms of their intentions and
Right.
everything. So I do get your point. But what about you? What do you pick out of the triangle?
So I think that it's more important to have a stronger relationship between the government and the media.
Okay,
Better trust, because the thing is that that's the only way the public is going to get the best information.
But sometimes,
right?
there might be a compromise in terms of objectivity as well when you expect the government to be best
it-
friends
the-
with media.
no, not friends.
Okay.
Not friends, but having enough information.
Okay. Flow
to
of
do their
information.
job. Yeah, having enough freedom to do their job, having enough information to do their job. That's the kind of trust I'm talking about. Not government, not letting journalists do their job,
Makes
because what
sense,
they're
makes
doing is really doing their job. They're not after anybody, in particular. They're just trying to be objective, trying to report on something. So when that is there, then obviously the public will get the right information.
Right. Okay.
And-
So you
and-
feel like
and
there should be a better relationship or trust factor.
The trust factor, and then the trust factor with the public will come like automatically.
Okay, perfect. So, this was recently, again, we went through, Pakistan happened to face a very unfortunate incident where there were, airstrikes and whatnot alleged, but there were a lot of journalists who were deployed at lines of control, sorry. I even know a lot of my friends went there from different organizations. And even you were sharing a story with me, right, where one of your friends had to. Please share it with us all.
So actually went to Balakot recently. ISPR had arranged for a trip for journalists to go there.
Okay.
And we were a group of 4 foreign journalists, foreign diplomats, military attaches, and we went to Balakot. We hiked up the hill. We saw the bomb craters, and then we went to the madrasa that was on top of the hill. And there was no damage over there.
course
That
there
the
wasn't,
Indian
yeah.
armed forces had said that
Claimed.
we've claimed that we have caused a lot of damage to the madrasa
And downed around 300
So,
people.
Right, but when we got there, if that was the case and the madrasa was sealed for 2 months, I believe.
Okay.
You would have seen like fresh paint, new construction, but none of that was there. I mean, it was still the way it was.
Right.
And we met with the children there at the madrasa, and I
And
mean,
Sana,
it didn't
isn't that
seem
great?
like
I mean, if you weren't allowed access to such a place, you wouldn't ever find out the facts. And it was also because of the satellite images that, everyone around the world found out that actually, made Pakistan even more innocent in the situation. What about you? What do you feel about this? I mean, the role of journalists being so courageous, first of all, to go out to such places just for the flow of information and putting their own lives at risks.
Well, yes, I mean, building upon the Balakot incident, what happened, I mean, it also, in effect, it built the narrative that Pakistan's government wanted to portray to the whole world.
Yeah.
So it's not only journalists against the government all the time, as, some of us are supposed to believe. It's also, sometimes they are working in cohesion, and they're working for their the common objectives and common goals.
Right.
And I mean, we're talking about Balakot. I mean, what would have happened if, for instance, there was no free press in the Iraq war?
Yeah, imagine.
Then Iraq war, what happened if this was said that this is not in the national interest of the United States, that journalists should be allowed to cover and should be allowed to discuss and debate about what the actual narrative was, then the world would have never found out about what happened over there.
Same in Vietnam War.
Vietnam, I was
War,
about
in
to
Watergate,
get to that, yes.
it brought down the government on its knees. And Nixon was claiming that it is in the national interest that information should be withheld. And he was projecting himself as a leader who was, who cannot be disposed of. He was saying that I'm indispensable for world peace, and he had just opened, not trade, but communication with China.
Right.
The opening of China had taken place. He was projecting himself as someone who is, putting the foreign policy much light years ahead of what earlier presidents had done. But still, the public and the United States laws, they put him on trial, and his even though the impeachment did not go ahead, but he was forced to resign.
Right. Okay.
Because, go ahead. And that was because of good journalism, right?
Yeah.
That was investigative journalism at its best.
Okay, now I'm going to put you both to test. I know we're short on time, my producers out there, I know, but this is going to be very quick because you mentioned Vietnam War, and it, just immediately raised a question in my mind. When you're talking about the Vietnam War, you cannot forget that one particular iconic photo from the Vietnam War of the girl, running and crying without her clothes. I believe I would term that as, again, unethical because there's so many issues, there's no permission. But again, in the war state, you're not even allowed to go out and, ask. Let's talk about self-accountability of journalists and their own self-ethics. Let's start with you, Saina.
So you talk about this image of the girl. Nick Ut actually took this image, and these were one of the most harrowing images that came out of Vietnam War.
Date.
That made sure that the government stops the war and calls its troops back. But the photographer, that photojournalist, Pulitzer Prize-winning photojournalist, he's still in touch with that girl.
Okay.
And she calls him Nick Ut, like she's 30, 40 years old now, but he still stays in touch with him. So that's how photojournalists work. They build a relation, they make a connection,
That's
and then
beautiful.
Yeah.
That's beautiful. So please, very quickly, some light upon, self-accountability, because it is a part of when you are, given access to freedom of press, you must be accountable yourself.
I think that the major opposition of the press, when they say that there have been crackdowns on press is taking place, and the media channels are being blocked, they're being told to go off air.
Yeah.
All these kind of objections, they would totally go away.
Okay.
Once these realizations, in certain quarters, I'm not talking about the media as a whole, as a general, but I mean there are certain people or certain media groups
Right.
who don't feel that they should have some kind of ethics or
Yeah.
self accountability. And there are many organizations, like the All Pakistan Newspaper Society.
Right.
And there is also, the Council of Pakistan Newspaper Editors,
Okay.
CPNE. And there are, many organizations over there which say that they have their own codes and they, abide by their codes. But sometimes I believe that self-accountability is missing. And that allows the government, to go into that, era where they have to go and enforce these kind of restrictions.
Right, right.
So I believe that accountability must come from within. Imposition of any kind of accountability upon the media persons has always, brought outrage from media quarters and also from global quarters.
Right.
And although legislation has taken place, as I talked about certain, subjects which are outside the purview of the journalists and the free press.
Okay.
But I mean, I still believe that unless accountability comes and comes fast,
Yeah.
we will not be able to say that, that our system is free of any defects.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for saying that, and thank you so much for such amazing insight, especially early in the morning on this day. This was Saina Bashir and Sheikh Danish Iftikhar, who happen to be journalists, ladies and gentlemen. Today we were celebrating Press Freedom Day, and this was a tribute to all the journalists, editors and publishers out there. You have no idea. I mean, you just watch them on screen or probably read their work on your tabs, on your papers. You have no idea the conditions that they go through just to get the information to you. Respect them, respect their work, and if you are being a journalist from your phone, please be a responsible and ethical one as well. If there's anything you learned from us, write us on a Facebook page with the name of World This Morning. On Twitter, World This Morning without a G. Daily Motion and YouTube, also World This Morning. And it's all right if you've missed this and are tuning in right now, because you can catch the repeat at 11 p.m. tonight. Till the next time, take care. Good morning.